Hey there, I hope you're having a great morning. And we are talking about nurturing connection and strength in families impacted by intergenerational trauma. So today may be a little bit longer. We have a lot of information to go through, and this is a really important part of the intergenerational resilience method because it's what integrates all the work we've done up to this point, and it's really what kind of integrates that resilience into the whole family system. So, just a question. Have you ever felt overwhelmed by trying to support families to build resilience when there are intergenerational trauma impacts? This is usually one of the hardest things because in therapy with these families, because it's a really complicated task to get to, but we have to get to the family resilience after we've addressed several other things. So that's why this is the fourth pillar of the intergenerational resilience method. So, working with complex families, it requires a framework that is both structured and flexible. So, we need to meet the unique needs of each family. We need to be flexible enough that we can change the intervention or kind of tweak it to fit what their immediate needs are, but also under a structure that follows evidence and science on what is helping to support families the most to build that resilience and to address intergenerational trauma. So, the aspects of that structure that we do need to include are calming that family nervous system through increased, improved regulation, and that's the autonomic regulation. We need to increase that earned secure attachment. We need to support the child and teen development because that's where the majority of the impacts are on the young generation, and that's how they get transmitted to the next generation. So we want to stop it from transmitting and kind of arrest it in the current parent-child relationship, but we also want to prevent it from entering into the next generation of parent-child relationships as well. And then after that, the fourth thing is we build family resilience and connection, and that's what we're going to work on today. So, today we're going to talk about how resilience applies to families. It's a little bit different than individual resilience. Identifying how do we identify and harness family strengths? How do we reshape the communication that's in families? And how the intergenerational resilience method builds that family resilience. How do we integrate the story into the family and create a narrative of resilience rather than a narrative of trauma or struggle? And how do we include cultural values and traditions as sources of strength? That is one of the most important things working with intergenerational trauma because there's so many different cultures that have been impacted by intergenerational trauma, and the impacts can be specific to that culture, that historical trauma, and we really need the flexibility to be able to meet the needs of those populations as well. So, the unique part of the Intergenerational Trauma Program is it purposely integrates family resilience in order to harness the resilience of previous generations. So, we're actually in this stage, we're looking at previous generations. We want to know how were they resilient? What evidence do we have of that? What were some of the things that they did in the past that are kind of filtering down in their strengths for now and today. It isn't a set of separate goals or exercises. It's kind of woven right into the entire framework of the intergenerational trauma program. But there are some interventions that we can do to help build and support this. It's really viewed as this is the heart of integrating that intergenerational resilience and harness the power of that. It also addresses the family patterns that we sometimes see that kind of repeat through generations, and nobody kind of realizes that it's happening, or they realize it's happening, but they don't know how to shift or change it, and they don't know how to harness it if it's more of a resilience factor. So In this, if we can get to those family patterns and harness the resilient ones while we address the ones that are more related to trauma, that's how we have an impact on both the current and future generations. So, we want to understand family resilience in the shadow of trauma. So, it's not the ability to bounce back after something bad happens. That's a pretty simplistic way to look at resilience. And it actually can be pretty offensive or shaming to some people who have endured 500 years of oppression or trauma. And we just say, well, just kind of snap back and grow from it. It doesn't work that way when you're dealing with adversity-based resilience. So adversity-based resilience leaves people feeling exhausted and overwhelmed, but they are resilient because they've adapted and they've survived conditions that some people may not have survived. So this adversity-based resilience is a different way of looking at resilience that accounts for generational patterns of trauma and pretty severe, specific, complex trauma as well. So sometimes with that adversity-based resilience, we kind of need to frame it that we've used coping skills that were helpful at the time, but they're no longer useful and they may actually be causing harm here and now. We also need polyvagal has to be incorporated into family resilience because it's a really critical part of building attachment. It's really the foundation. So the resilience of the autonomic nervous system, it's critical for individual family members, but it's also critical for the family system. So that's what we mean when we say it calms the family nervous system. It's calming and supporting co-regulation in order to have regulation in that family system. The co-regulation with autonomic resilience and flexibility, that's what calms that family nervous system. So this is why autonomic regulation is the first step in the intergenerational resilience method. It begins with impacting the family system immediately. We want to get in there and get that regulation so that it takes kind of the heat out of conflict, or it kind of warms up the relationships if there's been a lot of shutdown. So it improves co-regulation, and that's the foundation of attachment. So that's how these are connected. You've got regulation, co-regulation, and then attachment. So that is where this is really critical to be included in family resilience. So identifying the impacts of intergenerational trauma is really significantly important for mapping out the path of intervention. So our interventions need to follow a certain structure, but they also need to meet the goals of specific family members and meet their specific needs. So we kind of look at the impacts as either like a continuum or a spectrum of impacts, as well as we want to look at the resilience factors too, because we want to include these to support the family system. So it's not just looking at symptoms and trying to identify those symptoms in the family system. We also want to look for those resilience factors, which is, so this isn't a diagnostic type of approach, but it's more getting a really good map of the family and where they need areas of support and where they have some significant strengths. So in the Intergenerational Trauma Program, from phase one, we're working on resilience building. It starts and is designed so that resilience starts with the autonomic regulation, and it falls like dominoes between autonomic regulation, co-regulation in the parent-child relationship, earn secure attachment. That earn secure attachment improves the glitches in child development that you can see, or stops the impacts, which then they can have better connections in the family and can harness that resilience of previous generations. It's no small task, but it does build that resilience. So the next question becomes, how how do we even identify strengths and resources in families when some families live in total chaos, and finding those strengths and resources can be quite difficult? So, when we reach the point of building family resilience, there's a more accurate assessment of family strengths. So, when we have that autonomic regulation, we have more secure attachment, and we've addressed the impacts on the children. It puts they have more energy to identify these things, so they're not as focused on crises, and they can look back and see some of the factors of resilience in their family. And we all have a very different approach and perspective when we approach things from a regulated state. So that's the benefit of having the family resilience towards the end of those pillars of the Intergenerational Resilience Program, and also integrated into the Intergenerational Trauma Program. So, two ways that we really do this is we look at genograms to identify patterns of behavior. So, we want to look for those patterns that are passed down between generations. And we also want to look for evidence of resilience in previous generations so we can incorporate that as well. Um, so, the questions we might ask to do that are, where are outstanding family members? Who stands out as somebody that did something really good or really kind of spectacular in the family system generations back? Who resisted or put up a fight to oppression? That's really important for when you're talking about historical trauma or things related to certain cultures like war, all Indian residential schools, all of those things are really important. Like, who put up a fight against that? Because that's the foundation of building rights and healthy futures for the children. So, what are the family stories that are unique to this family, or even related to their culture? What are some of the things that are woven into the culture or this family that are the stories of strength and resilience? And these are the strengths that we incorporate into the current generation so that they can harness the power of the intergenerational resilience of previous generations and really integrate and identify that in the current family systems. So if you've ever watched some of those genealogy programs that will trace back, they'll take like a celebrity and they'll trace back and they'll look at all the ancestors, and there's all these kind of surprises. And when you see, I saw one that it was a woman that was she was a lawyer and an activist. And she was the only one that was kind of directly fighting against oppression in her cultural group, in her family. And when they went back in generations, like sometimes great grandfather was either a judge or a lawyer that did the same exact thing, but in a different kind of vein. So that was just a way to harness that resilience of that previous ancestor in the current generation. So I see this all the time in those shows. If you ever watch them, it's really interesting to see how they go back and look for those sources of resilience as well. So one of the next things we want to do with working with family resilience is to build healthy communication patterns. And the reason this is important is because as we increase earned secure attachment and address the trauma impacts for children, teens, and the adults, we need to have increased positive communication. Sometimes families get in certain patterns of how they relate, and even though they've done the work to increase their regulation and attachment, they may still have these patterns of communication, especially if they're very shut down or very high conflict. It can be really hard to get out of those patterns. But if we can help them develop new communication skills and strategies, it helps enhance the whole healing process. So it may be important to structure experiences them to improve communication, because this becomes so important. So some of the activities that can be done to do this, there's intergenerational activities that build understanding between generations. So that would be like a grandparent and a current teen, where they feel like there's such a gap because the grandparents don't know anything or don't understand, and the kids don't really know what the grandparents' experience was. So it's having structured interactions to improve those. They're actually intergenerational conversations. There's a structured way you can do it. You can do it in overall communities where you pair people up, and it may not be within their family, but it would be within their cultural group or in their community. So this really helps build connection between those generations and helps them have more compassion and understanding for each other, but also to have a greater understanding of what they're experiencing here and now or in the past for the older participants. So, intergenerational trauma therapy creates greater family resilience over time. So, it improves autonomic arousal, that improves co-regulation, creates the foundation for earned secure attachment. That earned secure attachment addresses the intergenerational impacts and development of the current child or teen generation. And those, when we address the child development, we minimize those impacts and we prevent having them spread to the next generation. So this is a really important part of, it may seem like kind of the cherry on top, but it's a really important part of the whole framework of supporting people with intergenerational trauma. So we do this through those polyvagal interventions. They're critical for autonomic regulation, relational neurobiology that's critical for attachment, and really interpersonal neurobiology is the overall umbrella for all of these interventions and the whole intergenerational resilience method, because that's where we get into the integration and kind of integrating previous generations' experience and resilience. It is a complex process to structure all this together. It took me 13 years of training, learning, working with families, took lots of money in training and costs of lost revenue from being out of the office, but you don't have to do that. There's an easier way with the Intergenerational Trauma Program. So that is how this is an efficient and effective system to support families impacted by intergenerational trauma. So we also want to look at adaptive mechanisms in families that can help enhance resilience and that draw on the latest neuroscience research. So if we frame their trauma-related behaviors as adaptive, it prevents the shame and overwhelm or the stuckness. So if we look at even disruptive behavior and look at how is that an adaptive behavior, because all behavior is adaptive. So how do we look at that to pull away like the shame or the blame or feeling stuck in this pattern? So moving from what was adaptive at one time, so that resistance, that those behavioral difficulties, that was adaptive at one time, but in the current circumstances, it's no longer adaptive, and now it causes problems in the current situation, in the current relationships. And this normalizes the need to make changes, and it provides some hope. If we need to move from things that used to work, those were adaptive behaviors. They just aren't working anymore. It's not that there's something wrong with the person or the child. They're just not working. So one of the ways we do this with the Intergenerational Trauma Program is through the cycle of neuroception. And that's working from state to story. So our autonomic state impacts the way that we interpret situations and we develop beliefs about ourselves and other people and our relationships with them. And it's really important to look at these state to story chains in that cycle, because it can really transform their understanding of the experience. If we can help them get to a more regulated state, that story will shift and change, and it'll be much more positive and adaptive if they have greater regulation and attachment. So, this also, that cycle of neuroception, understanding from state to story, also increases self awareness. It helps them be very aware of from between their autonomic state changing to their or their neuroception to their autonomic state changing to the emotions they experience, the behaviors, and then the beliefs or the story that they create around that. That's a huge cycle of self awareness that any part in that cycle, if they shift and change, it can change the outcome in the way that the person interprets the situation. So it creates new interpretations of that were related to negative self beliefs. And when we're dealing with intergenerational trauma, between ages 5 and 7 is a prime time to develop negative beliefs about the self that really aren't accurate. So that's, I'm not lovable, the world's a terrible place. Um, so it creates those interpretations, and we can shift those if we can move the state to story chain. It also, when we go through this and we introduce regulation into all these different parts of that cycle of neuroception, it reduces the faulty neuroception. It creates more accuracy in detecting threat, and it supports better regulation. So, if we don't go state to story and have new ways of understanding or intervening in that chain, it can amplify faulty neuroception. If we go through this and we have different interpretations, we have skills and strategies to intervene at all these different points, it can kind of dampen the reactivity, but it also creates more accurate neuroception. So now we're going to shift to looking at shared stories in intergenerational trauma. So, stories of previous generations build huge connection and integration of family experiences. And that's really what we want. In family therapy, when there's cutoffs between family members where there's generations that don't talk, or you don't talk to a certain person, or that's a person that the whole family avoids, we have to put safety first, where if it's not a safe person, we don't want to have a relationship or become vulnerable. But we also have to integrate that into the experience so that we're not kind of avoiding it or pushing it away or cutting it off. Those cutoffs are points of trauma in the family system. So we want to move more towards integration so that it's a more resilient family system, including the past generations. So building that family narrative is a huge opportunity to bridge the past with the present and harness that intergenerational resilience. So, when we have greater awareness of family patterns, we're able to shift or change those in the current generation. If we understand that several of our relatives in the past had substance abuse issues because they were dealing with traumas back 2 generations ago, we can understand that maybe we're at a little more risk for developing substance abuse problems. It's a way of coping that's been passed down to the family. And is it effective for me, or is it causing problems? So it gives them more opportunity to shift their current coping strategies and make changes in the current generation. It also reduces what we call split loyalty, where you can't have two relationships that are in competition with each other. So, an example of this would be if grandma is raising the grandchildren and the mom isn't able to raise the grandchildren, the grandparent sometimes may try to protect the child by splitting off or creating a split loyalty between the mom and the grandma. So if your mom really cared about you, she would be doing X, Y, and Z, or she's always been like that. Kids will always have a loyalty to their biological parent, no matter how difficult it is. In fact, sometimes the more difficult the things that have happened in the family and the traumas, sometimes that that loyalty is even stronger. So if we split that, that can be a source of real mental health problems for that child and a real source of struggle for the child. So we want to make sure we're not doing that even in generations past. So we don't want to have that's that side of the family and we're not dealing with that. We want to have that's the side of the family that has some more issues or difficulties, but it's still part of the family system. So we have to have greater awareness of those patterns in order to change them. And we don't want the avoidance or splits or the split loyalties or the cutoffs, because those are related to a lack of wellness in a family system. So I think this is the last thing we're going to talk about are the cultural values and traditions and using those as pillars of strength within the intergenerational resilience model. So culture is an integral part of intergenerational trauma therapy because there are huge cultural and historical traumas that impact a lot of the clients that we work with. Now, these cultural and historical traumas are different based on the community that you live in, the history, the person's background or culture, what they've gone through. So residential schools are very different from a war in the Middle East, or there's so many differences, but we need a way to integrate those for the particular families that we're working with. So this helps to understand our past generations, like how did those traumas impact previous ancestors and create some of these patterns that we see in the family, and how did it create some of the resilience or the fighting back that we see currently. And it supports that family into the integration of that family history and those resilience factors. So, with the Intergenerational Trauma Program and the Intergenerational Resilience Method, which is the core of the program, there's a flexible framework that includes any cultural norms and customs that you can kind of integrate into it. So there, I can't teach every cultural framework, but when a person is trained in this model and they're highly familiar with the culture, they can build those things um, into the model. So one of these things may be so for family resilience, one of the things that a lot of Indigenous families do is they have what's called either a flower day or a giveaway where they honor ancestors by having a feast or a meal, and they give small gifts to people that come to that. So that's a really good example of how you can take someone's culture and traditions and put them into this framework to support that individual person or that part of your community. I wouldn't recommend that you are the one that hold the flower day. You need to have somebody, an elder or someone, to help you kind of integrate those so that it's accurate and supportive of their culture. So the other part of this, when you're working with different cultures, it is so critical to have and really work towards cultural humility. We can't possibly know everything about a culture that we're not from, even about our own culture. It's really hard to know everything about it because it's so vast and expansive. And if we're working with a lot of different cultures, we're going to have a lot of shifting and changing and really learn those cultures, where it's really good to rely on elders or people from that culture that can help fit their customs and traditions into these various areas of supporting families impacted by intergenerational trauma. And we have to have openness regarding different cultures. Like that's kind of a basic in being a therapist, but it's really important with intergenerational trauma because so many different cultures have been impacted by intergenerational trauma. So that is a really important piece of this, and it's critical for fitting in and incorporating any culture into this model. So we have talked about how resilience applies to families, identifying and harnessing family strengths, reshaping some communication in families, how the intergenerational resilience method builds that resilience, integrating the family story to include resilience and cultural values and traditions as sources of strength. So that is kind of the capstone of this month of the intergenerational immersion calendar, where we're going through that was the theme for March, was the intergenerational resilience method. And that method is based on those four pillars: improving autonomic regulation, increasing earned secure attachment, supporting child development, building connection, and family resilience. So that's the final aspect of healing and integration within the family system. So next, we are going to be moving into advanced assessment. This is one of my favorite areas to look at because it really helps you get a clear picture of what's happening within a family in order to be able to best support them. The next method will continue looking at the intergenerational resilience method and how we use this to support assessment and doing some advanced assessment that's beyond what we have learned in our programs in school. So I hope you join me next week and we will continue on learning about intergenerational trauma and we'll start working on advanced assessment. So I hope you have a great day.